Now, considering the laryngopharynx, we can see that it is behind the larynx and extends from the upper border of the epiglottis to the lower border of the cricoid, and you can see the anterior relations. Over here is the inlet of the larynx, this one. There's also the posterior surface of the cricoid cartilage, as well as so this is the arytenoid cartilage, and this is the posterior surface of the cricoid cartilage. And you can see that on the lateral aspect there is a fossa known as the piriform fossa, and the epithelium is stratified squamous non-keratinized, which is what you would expect of most parts of the initial, especially the initial parts of the alimentary canal, where there's a lot of abrasion because of the passage of food. Now, one of the MCQs that they ask is that, as I've said, the piriform fossa is a feature of the lateral wall of the laryngopharynx. They ask which nerve is found behind the mucosa of the piriform fossa, and the answer is internal laryngeal nerve, which is why when you're cleaning up the piriform fossa, because sometimes they can be debris depositing over there, you have to be really careful, otherwise you might end up damaging the internal laryngeal nerve. And the internal laryngeal nerve is responsible for the sensory innervation of the supraglottic part of the larynx, and so if it is damaged while cleaning up the piriform fossa, there might be anesthesia in the supraglottic portion. Now, let's talk about the muscles, and then we will talk about the various layers and the structure, which is a rather important thing. So let's start with the constrictors. When you talk about the muscular layer, in the muscular layer there is the outer circular layer and there is the inner longitudinal layer. Outer circular layer, which is more important, and inner longitudinal layer. So you have to be able to remember that the circular muscles are outside and the longitudinal muscles are more inside. Right, so starting with the circular layer, we have three muscles, the superior constrictor. Right, so we have the superior constrictor. Talking about the origins, number one, in orange I have shown the origin. So this is the pterygoid hamulus this is the medial pterygoid plate, and this is its pterygoid hamulus, and the origin is coming off of the pterygoid hamulus. So let me just pterygoid hamulus, right? And this part of the superior constrictor is known as the pterygopharyngeus for this reason primarily. And the origin is also coming off of the pterygomandibular raphe, which is this part over here. This is the pterygomandibular. In purple is the pterygomandibular raphe, which extends from the pterygoid hamulus to the posterior surface of the mandible. This is the maxilla and this is the mandible. Right, so pterygomandibular raphe above pterygoid hamulus, below pterygomandibular raphe, and the part of the superior constrictor is known as the buccopharyngeus, and from the medial surface of the mandible at the posterior end of the mylohyoid line. Assume this is the mylohyoid line on the medial surface, which you cannot see, but I'm just showing it so you know the location. And part of the origin is going to be from the posterior end of the mylohyoid line on the medial surface of the mandible. Medial surface of the mandible, posterior end of the mylohyoid line, right? And that is going to be the myelopharyngeus. And the fourth point is from the posterior part of the tongue. In green, I have attempted to show the tongue. And so part of the origin will be from the lateral side of the posterior part of the tongue. And this part will be known as the glossopharyngeus, pterygopharyngeus, buccopharyngeus, myelopharyngeus, glossopharyngeus. And these are the origin of the superior constrictor. Number one from the pterygoid hamulus, number two from the pterygomandibular raphe, number three from the medial surface of the mandible behind the mylohyoid line. Number 4, from the lateral side of the posterior part of the tongue. We can write pterygoid hamulus, pterygomandibular raphe, and mandible behind the mylohyoid line, medial surface, and the tongue. Anyways, talking about, so these over here are the boundaries, and it extends into the lateral and the posterior wall of the pharynx, and at the back there is the formation of the median raphe. So this that I have outlined is the superior constrictor. Right, now let's talk about the middle constrictor. Takes origin from the lower part of the stylohyoid ligament. This is the stylohyoid ligament, and the origin is from the lower part of the stylohyoid ligament, this over here, lower part of the stylohyoid ligament, not the whole of it, just the lower part of it, right? And you can see the attachment. This is the mandible, and the attachment is lesser conua of the height bone. This is the lesser conua of the height bone, and this is the greater conua, the lesser conua of the height bone, and the upper border of the greater conua of the height bone. So that is all that you need to understand about the attachment. Lower part of the stylohyoid ligament, lesser conua of the height bone, upper border of the greater conua of the height bone. So this is the attachment for the middle constrictor. Lower border of the stylohyoid ligament, the lesser conua of the height bone, the upper border of the greater conua. Right, and we don't really give a particular name. Talking about the inferior constrictor, has two parts. This in purple is the thyropharyngeus, and in red is the cricopharyngeus. So the thyropharyngeus arises from the thyroid cartilage, as the name would suggest, and the cricopharyngeus from the cricoid cartilage, as the name would suggest. Thyropharyngeus, cricopharyngeus. So the origin of the thyropharyngeus is from an oblique line. This is the lamina of the thyroid cartilage, and there is an oblique line on the lamina of the thyroid cartilage from which the thyropharyngeus originates, and there is this tubercle known as the this tubercle known as the inferior tubercle, and also there is this tendinous band. This muscle over here is the cricothyroid, and there is this tendinous band that extends over the cricothyroid and is attached above to the inferior tubercle. Tendinous band crosses over the cricothyroid and is attached above to the inferior tubercle. So these are the attachment sites. Number 1, oblique line on the lamina of the thyroid cartilage, inferior tubercle of the thyroid cartilage, tendinous band arching over the cricothyroid and inserting above onto the inferior tubercle. Oblique line on the lamina of the thyroid cartilage, inferior tubercle of the thyroid cartilage, tendinous arch over the cricothyroid muscle. The cricopharyngeus finds its origin from the cricoid cartilage behind the origin of the cricothyroid. So this is the origin of the cricothyroid, and behind it we have the origin of the cricopharyngeus, and these happen to have different innervations which will be important in a while, the thyropharyngeus and the cricopharyngeus. Now if we talk about the longitudinal muscle cord, so those aren't that important. For example, we have the salpingo